Okay, this is Klee Wyck, a work of autobiographical nonfiction by Emily Carr. Chapter 1, Ucluelet. The lady missionaries expected me. They sent an enormous Irishman in a tiny canoe to meet the steamer. We got to the Ucluelet wharf soon after dawn. Everything was big and cold and strange to me, a 15-year-old schoolgirl. I was the only soul on the wharf. The Irishman did not have any trouble deciding which was I. It was low tide, so there was a long, sickening ladder with slimy rungs to climb down to get to the canoe. The man's big laugh and the tippiness of the canoe were even more frightening than the ladder. The paddle in his great arms rushed the canoe through the waves. We came to Toxis, which was the Indian name for the mission house. It stood just above high tide water. The sea was in front of it and the forest behind. The house was of wood, unpainted. There were no blinds or curtains. It looked, as we paddled up to it, as if it were stuffed with black. When the canoe stuck in the mud, the big Irishman picked me up in his arms and set me down on the doorstep. The missionaries were at the door. Smells of cooking fish jumped out past them. People lived on fish at Ucluelet. Both the missionaries were dignified, but the greater missionary had the most dignity. They had long noses straddled by spectacles, thin lips, mild eyes, and wore straight, dark dresses buttoned to the chin. There was only 2 of everything in the kitchen, so I had to sit on a box, drink from a bowl, and eat my food out of a tin pie dish. After breakfast came a long prayer. Outside the kitchen window, just a few feet away at the edge of the forest, stood a grand balsam pine tree. It was very tall and straight. The missionaries' trespasses jumped me back from the pine tree to the Lord's Prayer just in time to Amen. We got up from our knees to find the house full of Indians. They had come to look at me. I felt so young and empty, standing there before the Indians and the 2 grave missionaries. The chief, old hippie, was held to be a reader of faces. He perched himself on the top of the missionary's drug cupboard. His brown fists clutched the edge of it, his elbows taut and his shoulders hunched. His crumpled shoes hung loose as if they dangled from strings and had no feet in them. The stare of his eyes searched me right through. Suddenly they were done. He lifted them above me to the window, uttered several terse sentences in Chinook, jumped off the cupboard, and strode back to the village. I was half afraid to ask the missionary, "What did he say?" "Not much, only that you had no fear, that you were not stuck up, and that you knew how to laugh." Toxis sat upon a long, slow lick of sand, but the beach of the Indian village was short and bit deep into the shoreline. Rocky points jutted out into the sea at either end of it. Toxis and the village were a mile apart. The schoolhouse was halfway between the 2. Like them, was pinched between sea and forest. The schoolhouse called itself Church House on Sundays. It had a sharp roof, 2 windows on each side, a door in front, and a woodshed behind. The school equipment consisted of a map of the world, a blackboard, a stove, crude desks and benches, and, on a box behind the door, the pail of drinking water and a tin dipper. The lesser missionary went to school first and lit the fire. If the tide were high, she had to go over the hill at the forest edge. It was full of holes where high seas had undermined the big tree roots. Huge upturned stumps necessitated detours through hard-leafed salal bushes and skunk cabbage bogs. The lesser missionary hated putting her feet on the ground, which she could not see because it was so covered with growing green. She was glad when she came out of the dark forest and saw the unpainted schoolhouse. The greater missionary had no nerves and a long, slow stride. As she came over the trail, she blew blasts on a cow's horn. She had an amazing wind. The blasts were stunning, but they failed to call the children to school because no voice had ever suggested time or obligation to these Indian children. Then, the greater missionary went to the village and hand-picked her scholars from the huts. On my first morning in Ucluelet, there was a full attendance at school because visitors were rare. After the Lord's Prayer, the missionaries duetted a hymn while the children stared at me. When the missionary put ABC on the board, the children began squirming out of their desks and pattering down to the drinking bucket. The dipper registered each drink with a clank when they went through it back. The door squeaked open and shut all the time, with a second's pause between opening and closing. Spitting on the floor was forbidden, so the children went out and spat off the porch. They had not yet mastered the use of the pocket handkerchief, so not a second elapsed between sniffs. Education being well underway, I slipped out to see the village. When I did not return after the second's time permitted for spitting, the children began to wriggle from the desks to the drinking bucket, then to the spitting step, looking for me. Once outside, their little bare feet never stopped till they had caught me up. After that, I was shut up tight at Toxus until school was well started. Then I went to the village, careful to creep low when passing under the school windows. On the point at either end of the bay crouched a huddle of houses, large squat houses made of thick hand-hewn cedar planks, pegged and slotted together. They had flat, square fronts. The side walls were made of driftwood. Bark and shakes weighted with stones against the wind were used for roofs. Every house stood separate from the next. Wind soared through narrow spaces between. Houses and people were alike. Wind, rain, forest, and sea had done the same things to both. Both were soaked through and through, with sunshine, too. I was shy of the Indians at first. When I knocked at their doors and received no answer, I entered their houses timidly. But I found a grunt of welcome was always waiting inside, and the Indians did not knock before entering. Usually, some old crone was squatted on the earth floor, weaving cedar fiber or tatters of old cloth into a mat, her claw-like fingers twinkling in and out along the strands that were fastened to a crude frame of sticks. Papooses tumbled around her on the floor, for she was a papoose minder as well as a mat maker. Each of the large houses was the home of several families. The door and the smoke hole were common to all, but each family had its own fire with its own things around it. That was their own home. The interiors of the great houses were dim. Smoke teased your eyes and throat. The earth floors were not clean. It amused the Indians to see me unfold my camp stool, and my sketch sack made them curious. When boats, trees, houses appeared on the paper, jabbering interest closed me about. I could not understand their talk. One day, by grin and gesture, I got permission to sketch an old mat maker. She nodded, and I set up to work. Suddenly, a cat jumped in through the smoke hole and leaped down from a rafter onto a pile of loose boxes. As the clatter of the topple ceased, there was a bestial roar, a pile of mats and blankets burst upwards, and a man's head came out of them. He shouted, and his black eyes snapped at me, and the old woman's smile dried out. "Clattawa!" Chinook for go, she shouted, and I went. Later, the old wife called to me across the bay, but I would not heed her call. "Why did you not reply when old Mrs. Winook called you?" the missionary asked. "She was angry and drove me away." "She was calling, 'Klee Wyck, come back, come back,' when I heard her. What does Klee Wyck mean?" "I do not know." The mission house door creaked open, and something looking like a bundle of tired rags tumbled onto the floor and groaned. "Why, Mrs. Winook," exclaimed the missionary, "I thought you could not walk." The tired old woman leaned forward and began to stroke my skirt. "What does Klee Wyck mean, Mrs. Winook?" asked the missionary. Mrs. Winnook put her thumbs into the corners of her mouth and stretched them upward. She pointed at me. There was a long, guttural jabber in Chinook between her and the missionary. Finally, the missionary said, "Klee Wyck is the Indian's name for you. It means laughing one." The old woman tried to make the missionary believe that her husband thought it was I, not the cat, who had toppled the boxes and woke him. But the missionary, scenting a lie, asked for straight talk. Then Mrs. Winnook told how the old Indians thought the spirit of a person caught in a picture of him. Then Mrs. Winnook told how the old Indians thought the spirit of a person got caught in a picture of him, trapped there, so that after the person died, it had to stay in the picture. "Tell her that I will not make any more pictures of the old people," I said. It must have hurt the Indians dreadfully to have the things they had always believed trampled on and torn from their hugging. Deep down, we all hug something. The great forest hugs its silence. The sea and the air hug the spilled cries of seabirds. The forest hugs only silence. Its birds and even its beasts are mute. When night came down upon Ucluelet, the Indian people folded themselves into their houses and slept. At the mission house, candles were lit. After eating fish and praying aloud, the missionaries creaked up the bare stair, each carrying her own tin candlestick. I had a cot and scrambled quickly into it. Blindless and carpetless, it was a bleak bedroom, even in summer. The room was deathly still. Outside, the black forest was still too, but with a vibrant stillness tense with life. From my bed, I could look 1 story higher into the balsam pine. Because of his closeness to me, the pine towered above his fellows, his top tapering to heaven. Every day might have been a Sunday in the Indian village. At Toxus, only the 7th day was the Sabbath. Then the missionaries conducted service in the schoolhouse, which had shifted its job to church as the cow's horn turned itself into a church bell for the day. The Indian women with handkerchiefs on their heads, plaid shawls around their shoulders, and full skirts billowing around their legs, waddled leisurely toward the church. It was very hard for them to squeeze their bodies into the children's desks. They took 2 whole seats each, and even then, the squeezing must have hurt. Women sat on one side of the church. The very few men who came sat on the other. The missionaries insisted that men come to church wearing trousers, and that their shirt tails must be tucked inside the trousers. So the Indian men stayed away. Our trespasses had been dealt with, and the hymn, which was generally pitched too high or too low, had at last hit square when the door was swung violently back, slopping the drinking bucket. In the outside sunlight stood old Tanuk, shirt tails flapping and legs bare. He entered, strode up the middle of the room, and took the front seat. Quick intakes of horror caught the breath of the woman. The greater missionary held on to her note. The lesser jumped an octave. A woman in the back seat took off her shawl. From hand to hand, it traveled under the desk to the top of the room, crossed the aisle, and passed into the hand of Jimmy John, who was old Tanuk's nephew, and sitting with the men. Jimmy John squeezed from his seat and laid the shawl across his uncle's bare knees. The missionary's address rolled on in choppy Chinook, undertoned by a gentle voice from the back of the room, which told Tanuk in pure Indian words what he was to do. With a defiant shake of his wild hair, old Tanuk got up. Twisting the shawl about his middle, he marched down the aisles, paused at the pail to take a loud drink, dashed back the dipper with a clank, and strode out. The service was over, the people had gone, but a pink print figure sat on in the back seat. Her face was sunk down on her chest. She was waiting till all were away before she slunk home. It is considered more indecent for an Indian woman to go shawlless than for an Indian man to go bare-legged. The woman's heroic gesture had saved her husband's dignity before the missionaries, but had shamed her before her own people. The greater missionary patted the pink shoulder as she passed. "Brave woman," said the greater missionary, smiling. One day I walked upon a strip of land that belonged to nothing. The sea soaked it often enough to make it unpalatable to the forest. Roots of trees refused to thrive in its saltiness. In this place, belonging neither to sea nor to land, I came upon an old man dressed in nothing but a brief shirt. He was sawing the limbs from a fallen tree. The swish of the tree tried to drown the purr of his saw. The purr of the saw tried to sneak back into the forest, but the forest threw it out again into the sea. Sea and forest were always at this game of toss with noises. The fallen tree lay crosswise in this nothing's place. It blocked my way. I sat down beside the sawing Indian, and we had dumb talk, pointing to the sun and to the sea, the eagles in the air and the crows on the bench. Nodding and laughing together, I sat and he sawed. The old man sawed as if aeons of time were before him, and as if all the years behind him had been leisurely, and all the years in front of him would be equally so. There was strength still in his back and limbs, but his teeth were all worn to the gums. The shock of hair that fell to his shoulders was grizzled. Life had sweetened the old man. He was luscious with time like the end berries of the strawberry season. With a final grin, I got up and patted his arm. "Goodbye." He patted my hand. When he saw me turn to break through the forest so that I could round his great fallen tree, he ran and pulled me back, shaking his head and scolding me. "Swawa! Hiu swawa!" Swawa were cougar. The forest was full of those great cats. The Indians forbade their children to go into the forest, not even into its edges. I was to them a child, ignorant about the wild things which they knew so well. In these things, the Indian could speak with authority to white.